Yes, Kai Kai.
Dad,
Bugs?
The outtakes.
The orange juice, but Jenny's not allowed.
Okay, but maybe don't do that and wait for mommy because daddy's just filming. Beautiful. Welcome to another episode of Underrated Ideas with your host, Romero. And thanks to King's College London and Lilayi Lodge, we're out here in Zambia and discovering new things. I'm not going to, go on forever as I usually do. I'm going to let Nick introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about who he is. And yeah, let's kick off the episode. Nick, please.
Hello, thanks for having me. My name is Nick Wightman. I am a Zambian-born but Canadian-raised and now fully back living in Zambia botanical consultant. So most of my work takes me around the country, sometimes into other surrounding countries, doing survey work for vegetation assessments, either be it for development projects or for conservation projects especially.
That's cool. I want to try and swing us all the way back. You were born in Zambia. Where in Zambia were you born? Because there's these things are the questions where people kind of, I think, miss them a lot of the time. Because when you talk, we always talk about what we're currently doing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our past sometimes just helps shape up how we end up where we are.
Yeah.
So where in Zambia were you born?
I was born down in Chikinkata. And back in those days, that fell under Matsbuka district, but now Chikinkata is its own district. And that was back in 1981. And then my mum, who is Canadian, and my father was Zambian, my mum brought my brother and I back to Canada, where we then grew up and did all of our schooling. Partway through my university, I took a year and came back to Zambia, and I experienced my first rainy season here since leaving as a toddler, effectively. And kind of at that point decided that I think I'd rather be in Zambia and have much better weather than suffering every year in the cold in Canada. And then took approximately 7 more years to finish off my undergraduate, do a master's, and still traveling back occasionally. Before finally settling in Zambia full-time in 2013.
Wow. So, when you came back, that rainy season, what is it? Because, it's sometimes when you're here, and you're born here, and you're raised here, and you experience it, it's normal, so you don't see the difference.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about now, having lived in the UK for a few years, few too many years. But, what is it about the rainy seasons here?
I think because our cycle is dictated by wet and dry here. There are certain elements of that are very lucky in that we have very consistent weather that we can guarantee. Well, we're going to have sunny days and everything like that from this period to this period. But it is usually also that kind of, by the time the rains should be approaching, you're ready for that kind of change. You're ready for something to happen. And even nature is ready for it to happen too. Even before the rains, trees start to put out flowers or new leaves. You see more kind of activity happening. And I think for me, because even when I lived in the north, I loved spring the most when winter had kind of lost its grip and things started coming back. But the element that got me was that when I was here for that first rainy season, as an adult especially, everything was new. I didn't know, I got the Know Your Trees book, and I would take that and walk around the property and try and figure out which was which. But my main interest has always been the herbs that grow as, rains come on and stuff like that. So that first season, in 2006, 2007, when I came back, I just was amazed by the wildflowers that were coming up on our plot. And it just seemed so magical that these things just popped out of the ground.
Like out of nowhere.
Yeah, and every day I would walk first thing in the morning and go and have a look as to, has anything new come up? So I spent almost, 2-3 months solid just getting up first thing, walking around the garden and seeing what's there. And it just inspired me to then say, well, why not learn a bit more? And then as I progressed into that kind of knowledge of the botany here in Zambia, you start to realize that the south holds quite a different set of flora than what the north is, and the northeast is different from the northwest.
Yeah.
And eventually you come to that realization that Zambia holds a very interesting kind of position on the continent, in this southern part of the continent, where we have affinities to the south, we have affinities to the northeast, and we have affinities to the northwest.
Yeah.
And it's this very interesting kind of meeting points, not just on the flora, it also happens to be on birds and mammals and things like that. And it just makes Zambia so much more interesting than to explore, I find, yeah.
The funny thing is, when you living abroad, and even when we were younger, there was always talk about animals. It's always the big five when it comes to tourism. And I grew up on a farm, and I remember getting back to the UK and being involved in this podcast, funny enough, with Dr. Duraid Jalili, my co-host. And he was asking me questions about plants. And I was like, yeah, I never thought about that. And then
I must admit, it is a little bit of a thorn in my side, because pushing for conservation of animals, especially the larger animals that we normally would know conservation funding pitches for, they are usually at some higher level of the trophic system, whereas plants and some of those other things are usually at the bottom.
Yeah.
So I've always wondered, why isn't it that funding doesn't actually take into account, first and foremost, that first trophic level, so that everything that depends on it can also benefit in the grand scheme. So I actually did start up an organization with 2 other friends here in Zambia. It's the Zambezi Horticultural and Botanical Research Institute, where we are looking at expanding what potentially could be grown on the horticultural level. So that could be other tropical crops, other things that, we grow bananas in Zambia, but there's a wealth of different banana types that we haven't grown. So we want to see what can grow well in different areas of Zambia, and can this be a potential new introduction? And that's on one of my friends' sides. I, on the other hand, am the botanical side, whereas my interest is pushing, especially conservation of botanical species that are either endemic to Zambia or that have only been known from maybe 1 or so collections within Zambia.
Okay.
So this idea of lost species, where we have certain species in Zambia that were collected in the 1930s and have never been recollected. And it brings about the question to then say, was it still existing? If so, how is it growing and where? And these are then things that I would like to try and push for, so that we could get conservation assessments for them. One of my big thoughts nowadays is, especially on the plant side, is conservation through cultivation.
Yeah.
So can these things be brought into cultivation? Can we grow them a little bit more widely in Zambia? Can we spread that around the world, so that if the natural habitat is destroyed or has affected in any way, we're not losing that species altogether? Plants are very, they have less baggage than animals and the fauna when it comes to ethical considerations. So why are we not kind of doing that and bringing these things in? I'm a big believer in conservation of the landscape and things like that, but also one has to be practical in Zambia, and that if a project really wants to go ahead and you have local people who are pushing for that project, it's going to be hard to stop it based on one specific species that might be in that area. So can we not recognize to then say, well, maybe, let's save the species, but then if we try and establish it in other places, can we do that? And so this is where the conservation through cultivation comes in. But there is such a wealth of that, but there's very little funding usually for the plant side, unfortunately.
It's and I think that's what got me about the lodge, with what you guys are doing here. When I was like, tree safari walk. My son loves birds. He loves, generally plants anything that that's natural,
Yeah.
he's like, oh, that's this and that's that. And we'd watch things and I'd have to ask him because I'm like, oh, what was that? And he's like, oh, it's this. And I'm like, okay, you know. And I realized, I was like, I need to get myself not more well-versed for the sake of like becoming an expert, but these are our lands. And I started looking to syntropic agriculture, like syntropic forests. And I was like, wow, there's so much that we can do in small spaces and produce more and incorporate a lot of this stuff that we kind of like now with the indigenous stuff. But why don't we?
Because usually on that scale, we don't necessarily think that it would make a difference.
Okay.
So I live, like I said, I don't live very far from here. And a few years ago now, I was just working at night, and I heard my dogs barking in particular. But it was a different type of bark to what I was used to. So I just peeked out the window, and they were kind of standing in a circle and barking at the center. And I thought, okay, that's really weird. So I went out, and I kind of approached them, and they were barking at this little ball in the center of their circle. And I thought, okay, what is this? And it was a four-toed hedgehog, an African hedgehog. And, you know, in talking to a bunch of my friends who are on the animal side, they've never even seen such a thing. They're very, I don't know how rare they are, but I certainly had never seen one.
Yeah.
And that's in an area that is mostly built up with residential houses. You know, some people might have fully manicured their 5 acres or things, whereas for me, I have all natural remaining trees.
Yeah.
I have certain bird species and the large, the pouched rat that also exist on my plot, mainly just because I'm not going through and destroying that kind of habitat. You kind of keep it, let the grass grow tall and then fall over. It creates the habitats for them. But I'm at a loss to then say how the hedgehog ever came to my plot, because, like I say, it's developed all around me. I don't know whether it was there initially or whether or not it managed to find the plot. But if you then kind of, you know, it's that idea of like that old movie, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Yeah. Well, in this case, I just left it and it came.
Yeah.
I then actually relocated it here to the lodge. Yeah. Mainly just because they've got a lot more space and my dogs would not leave it alone. So it was unfortunate that I couldn't keep it at my place. But I think the main thing there is that we just think that it doesn't make a difference. And ultimately, it does. They will find that space if you leave it available for them, effectively. Yeah. If you stop mowing your lawn, you will find trees and all sorts of things start to move in because all of a sudden you've stopped that impact, and things can start to regrow effectively.
So, moving more to what you guys are doing at the lodge now, tell us a little bit more about this tree safari and what excites you most about it.
Well, the tree safari started. It started as a means of during COVID. I basically had almost no work. Yeah. When COVID hit and the world kind of closed down, a lot of that kind of money that comes in from overseas and sort of development work and conservation just stopped effectively. Yeah. So I had about a 2-year period where I had almost no projects whatsoever. And then as a means of keeping myself sane, I approached Lilayi Lodge just to get permission to go around and look at the vegetation because there's something to be said about, you know, keeping the mind going while you're in a difficult situation. So I started doing that. I made up a vegetation assessment, and I submitted that to them. And then Ian Miller got in contact with me and saying that he would like to go around and start identifying trees and labeling the trees. So it actually just started through that. And we would make a regular kind of time of it where we would come, spend the morning or an afternoon, depending on the time of day, go around seeing if we could find, you know, different trees to identify and tag. And initially it starts out really well, and you tag almost, a quarter of them in one day because everything is new, so to speak.
Yeah.
But very quickly you hit that law of diminishing returns, and that you go out more and more, you find fewer and fewer because you've already found most of them.
Yeah.
But we had to do it over different seasons because different things might flower at different times of year. And it was that scenario that, it became kind of a nice ritual to go out with Ian, meet him at the front of the lodge property, jump into his vehicle, and we would just drive around and basically see what was there at the time. Sometimes it was a little bit more difficult in terms of saying, okay, well, I think this is a different species, but let's wait until there's flowers to confirm it and whatnot. So it was sometimes a start and stop on actually including new species because you're just waiting for it to flower so that you can say, yes, it's this one specifically.
And the funny thing about this is I think back to ancient times. I had a conversation with a guy called Richard Webb, who's running Cataloguing farm on the Zambezi. And he is we're not doing anything new. People think of conservationists as if it's this new term and new people coming to life, and it's we're actually just going backwards in time because the knowledge is the knowledge is there. When the locals go into the back in the day when they would go into the forest and they would forage, they knew what they were foraging and they had to study it.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say about that now though is that we're at a point in time where we've never had the population pressure on the landscape comparatively.
Yeah.
So when people say, well, that's always been there, yes, it has, but there, 100 years ago, there weren't 100 and so many people per square kilometer than there is now.
Yeah.
So we do have to then kind of understand that, these are practices that have lasted for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But we do have to take into account the population that exists now in comparison to then saying, well, this is how it worked previously, this is how it will work.
No,
it can't be. We have to be saying, yes, let's look at those past practices.
Yeah.
Let's choose the ones that actually work better in a situation where the population is on the higher side, because that's what we really need to understand. We can't be just going through and harvesting like it was 100 years ago, because if you only have 2 or 3 people going out in a year to harvest versus 30, 40, 50 now,
it makes a huge difference.
It makes a massive difference.
In terms of the traditional knowledge, I guess, that's the scope. How much of the names and the species names have you incorporated with that type of data?
Well, I have tried to incorporate all of the local names, the vernacular names, into the data that then I provided to the lodge as a means of making it much more interactive for people, no matter what the background is.
Nice.
But those all are Zambian vernacular names, so if you're coming from Zimbabwe, Mozambique,
they all have different
I can't
names.
guarantee you that it's going to be the same.
No, but I mean, it's a starting point, because the funny thing is, we've traveled so much. I shared with you before we started the podcast, my great-grandmother was from Mozambique, Black Mozambican. And again, she ended up living in Harare, in Zimbabwe, and Chinoi. Yeah. So it's the travel is there, and she wouldn't have called the names. She'd look at a tree and go, "Oh, that's that," and then my grandfather would say, "Yeah, but it's that." And it's it's the same tree, guys.
It is, and I think this is the very interesting thing when I go out and do my consulting work is that, in consulting with somebody who's local to an area, I usually will have to find the name that will work for them. Or I'll say a name and they'll just change it slightly. There's a different vowel or something like that. It ends in an A rather than an E. Yeah. And I think that's what makes it very interesting in terms of understanding the interconnectedness of a lot of these trees to different tribes as well. Yeah. Noting the different uses is also a very important aspect, just to get an idea as to what might the pressure be on a certain species comparatively to others, effectively.
Yeah. What's your linkage in terms of the traditional names? I don't know, so in Zimbabwe in particular, when we would name a tree, we'd name it according to what it helps with. So there's a tree called the masusu. It produces a fruit called the masusu. There's no word in the current shona for susu doesn't mean anything. But when you speak to the people of that space, they say susu means stomach.
Oh,
So
okay, yeah.
so like, have you found a lot of that in the data that you like with the traditional names? Or
I don't have a good enough background in the vernaculars
okay,
to
cool.
really be able
to pinpoint that. Yeah.
But it reminds me a lot of how in European culture, a lot of the common names would have something to do with its use.
Yes.
So a tree might be called spleenwort.
Yeah.
And it was taken that it would help with functions of the spleen, or liverwort for something like that kind of scenario. And it makes a lot of sense, because if that's what people would use it for, why wouldn't they then refer back to it in terms of its usage effectively?
And I think also that's one of the bigger hopes for me with stuff like this, with what you guys are doing, is that more people will visit and start to, it reignites a language that we may be losing. You know, Shauna in particular, like that one little example, I was like, we don't even use the word susu anymore. It's like it's gone. It's extinct from our vocabulary.
Well, but it does make sense when you look at the fact that the modern life that we know now didn't exist 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And there are things that are going to be lost in that conversion to how things are now. Even looking at the rural-urban divide, there are things in urban and rural areas that people will know a meaning for something that in the urban space they don't, because they really have no concept. You know, if you were to find a regular Zambian here and bring them out and say, okay, where's this tree? They probably wouldn't even know the name of the tree in their own language, just because there is a disconnect all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that is a problem.
Yeah.
But it does speak to the fact that, you know, as society has moved forward, connections have been lost. It would be great to see if something like this could start to re-establish those connections going forward effectively.
I mean, I for one respect you saying like it's not a problem. For me, it's a major problem. Like, it's a loss of culture to a certain extent, you know. And these type of projects, these type of security banks, you know, knowledge banks, that are non-existent, you know. It's like, you could look at it from the conservationist space, where you're like, you talk about cultivation, and you're like, yeah, we can save some of these species by just moving them around. Also, like with climate change, things that like the climate may not be able to accommodate for some of the things that we have. So we're gonna have to move it.
Yes. Or it might start finding its way into those habitats, even if we don't necessarily push it, just because it's more conducive to growing there than it was previously. You know, I think what I also see in the benefit of something like the Tree Safari, if Lilayi Lodge takes it forward that way, is long-term monitoring of trees, of known trees, where if you have rainfall data and you have the tree's location, you can then over time start to understand, are growing conditions changing for it? Is its growing cycle changing as well? That would be a lot more work in terms of getting out there, knowing flowering periods, monitoring rainfall in such a way where you then have, the exact data for that this year, and doing tree measurements, DBH measurements, and things like that. So you could then say, well, yes, it's grown by 2 centimeters in girth over 5 years, and this is the rainfall data we have in that. And if you start developing those kinds of baselines, that will give you really good indication of how well things are doing as our climate changes even further. You know, in the last 5 years, because I monitor rainfall at my place, in the last 5 years, I think we've had about 3 years where rainfall is under the average for Lusaka. But we don't really know how that's going to affect, you know,
vegetation and then life in general.
Exactly. And then on top of that, how is that going to affect insects, species that then depend on it further as well? So there is a huge kind of benefit in having, at least starting the baseline and taking it from there. Unfortunately, you know, the botany side doesn't have as many diehard enthusiasts comparatively to something like, well, I hope, I got my fingers crossed on that, but ornithology, people who come looking at birds, so many more people who will come and, you know, clock bird visits on their apps and all sorts of things like that. It's a different scenario still on the vegetation side, where you need, unfortunately, you still need a fairly good scope on the different families and how things fit in. Because if you're just a casual observer, you say, well, okay, that's a grass. I might look at it and be like, well, technically it's actually a sedge. But, it's a bit of a block in terms of the entry for people to get into it who'd like to contribute more. But the knowledge is not fully there. So it would be lovely if this kind of spurs on more people to take an interest. And, hopefully it starts with trees and then spreads to everything else. That would be my wish, effectively. But it is encouraging, at least, that we've now got an arboretum coming up in Lusaka. That Lilayi is taking a really good interest in the initial vegetation that they have, because the trees is the first one that most people get an interest for, and then it goes from there, effectively. And, what I've always said to Ian and anybody who will listen about Lilayi is that this is a bit of a time capsule for what would have existed in terms of the vegetation for this area 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Because now if you look on the map, we're surrounded by housing development and or farms. There's almost no natural vegetation that exists anymore in this configuration where you have anything larger than a 20 by 20 meter section of original trees. Everything else has literally been mown down effectively.
So when we talk about development and what development has come to, like, my mother-in-law is currently putting a school up somewhere just outside of Livingston, and they made these traditional, like, mud hut kind of chicken runs, and they were told, not to make it political, but I'm saying they were told that wasn't the right type of thing to put up. As somebody who's in sustainable development, I'm like, well, it returns to the ground when they stop using it, and they can repair it because all the materials are locally sourced. It's perfect for the environment, rather than them going and getting bags of cement, that are 100 miles off thing. But the understanding of development, I feel, is something that we've struggled with in Africa.
Very much so, It's not something that we have pushed ourselves or blazed a trail. It's something that has been brought in as a certain way of doing it, and we've just adopted that and go forward. There is huge need for that idea of development, but not for development's sake. We need to be able to look at a possible development and say, okay, what is that impact actually going to be? Because if, God forbid, 5 years things fall apart, if you had a natural structure and it was left for 20 years, as you say, it'll slowly go back into the environment. If it's cement blocks or anything like that, metal roofing, all of those kinds of things, it'll sit there for decades. It'll slowly break apart, but it'll still sit there for decades. And then what is the footprint that has in the global kind of idea of carbon? Whereas cement, so much higher in carbon than if you're looking at local materials. It would be nice for the authorities to be looking at some of these indigenous building styles and whatnot, and trying to figure out a way that we can kind of meld them into a modernity that still allows for the usage of those, without that kind of looking back and people discounting it just because it is traditional. It's funny, you look at a lot of places on the tourism side, they're not building hugely modern buildings and stuff like that. They're building with, local burnt bricks. They're building with thatch. And they're the ones who are then charging through the roof for people to come and stay there. So what is driving it there is that idea of being authentically African. But when it comes to development of our cities, even for people's own landscapes, it's not driven by that idea of authentically to our location. It's driven more by, more of a Western kind of look at how this development should be put in place. I think it also really, there's a lot more need for people to kind of dissect what development they're doing and what the end goal is going to be on that. So if you are doing chickens, and your intent is not necessarily to be doing it on a massive commercial scale, then what's the problem in doing more traditional chicken runs and everything like that? Yeah,
and I think it's like these things, like as you said, we're looking at the environment, and we're looking at like the safari as a, for me, it's like a great blueprint. Like, you know, it's like, what should your yard contain?
Yeah.
You know, do you have some of these species? And you should. You know, they are made for this environment.
Yes and no. You know, we have several different types of vegetation in Zambia.
Yeah.
The one that we're most known for is the Miombo woodlands, which will exist into Mozambique, surrounding countries. A lot of the trees from Miombo woodlands are much more difficult to grow. So the stuff that we generally tend to plant in urban settings as house trees and things like that tend to be trees that are more adapted to riverine or riparian zones because we water them a lot more. And they're used to that high levels of water. But a tree in the Miombo that does not get water from April until October or November, if you're watering it, you tend to then potentially increase the chances for disease and pest issues that will then make their way into those species because you're taking it out of its natural conditioning and you're enforcing on it something that's wetter, which doesn't always work well.
What you just said there about that one particular thing, for me, that hits like compounds. Compounds are badly watered, they have very little water and very little vegetation, you know, and it's like, how do we get green back into our spaces? Like in Harare, we still got a lot of green.
Yeah.
Like in a lot of our, like we've got football fields that are covered, you know, and there's trees hanging over them and stuff. I came to Zambia and I was like, where's the football field? And they point at this like dusty brown space, and I'm like, this is different. And not to say that it shouldn't be that way. Well, I don't think it should. I think there should be vegetation everywhere for me personally, you know. But again, it's that understanding of like, this is what we regard as vegetation, grass.
Yeah, but
and we should
is it traditional?
And we have to water it consistently, as you said. But not every space, and most spaces in Zambia, when we look at the masses, we've got maybe 15-20% of people who can afford to do this.
Yeah.
And then the rest, who are trying to live a certain type of life, can't afford that.
Yeah.
And it's like, we just don't know enough about the natural environment.
Well, my one take on it, and I'll say this to everybody, is if we were supposed to have green lawns all throughout the year in the center of Africa, we'd have a rainy season that goes all year in the center of Africa. The thing is, we don't. And, you know, I think when it comes to that idea of especially someone's private space within their yard, do you need to have green grass everywhere, regardless of the size, if you spend most of your time sitting on your patio? In the far corners of your yard, do you need a green lawn over there? That kind of thing. You know, but it's a scenario that people have it because it's kind of traditional. When colonialists came, they did it. So we've kind of adopted the colonialist mentality of that's how you live, effectively, when you live in towns. There's something to be said about actually being able to have a space. So at my house, I don't water any lawns. I'm a big believer, if you're going to water anything in the dry season, make it vegetables or fruit trees. You should be able to get something product from that with the use of that water. Because I can't eat grass. I don't know anybody else who can eat grass effectively, but I strictly only water that. Everything else has to be able to put up with the dry season. And in that way, you know, my water usage hopefully is lower. It's actually quite high because I grow a fairly large area of vegetables. I have citrus and things like that do take up water during the dry season and stuff like that. So it's higher than what I would like it to be, but I also do like having fruit. So I'm willing to put the water into it in order to be able to get that back. But it is a mindset. I have an area on my back patio where I've got all of those kinds of tropical plants that people would plant in the ground. I just have them in pots on the back patio where I sit and I spend that time. I don't go well into the garden, sit there, and choose to spend it way out in the middle of the garden. No, I'm sitting close by where I've got my Wi-Fi access and everything like that, right? It's a modern household in that regard. But it is a question of, looking at that scenario of saying, we have water. Will I always have water? Because I can't guarantee that is the case. I am like everybody else around this area. I have a borehole. I pump water out of the ground for our household, for the workers' households that live on the plot as well, for the garden. When my parents drilled that borehole 50 odd years ago, they didn't concern themselves about water. It was always there.
Yeah.
I can't guarantee that that's going to be the case for myself going forward.
Yeah.
Because since my parents built, we've had a lot more people move into the area. We've had people break up those 5 acres into 5 plots or develop a 10-unit residential space on their things. And so it's increased the number of households that are living in that area. It's increased the water usage that's in that area. And that's going to have an effect in the long run. What do you do at that stage? If you have 5 acres of manicured lawns, what happens one day when your borehole goes dry? Are you going to bring in, a tanker every time to water your lawn? Or at that stage, you start to think, well, it's costing me a lot of money. We don't put the cost associated with having a green lawn out there.
No.
It's one of those kinds of scenarios. Well, I have the electricity, or I have a solar pump. I just pump it out of the ground and I water.
Yeah.
Well, what is the actual cost of that? We don't pay. I physically don't pay for the water that comes out of the ground.
No.
I pay for the electricity to pump it out of the ground, but I don't pay for that water.
Yeah.
What is the value we should be putting on water these days?
And that is a huge calculation and question that I think is really hard for us to get around.
And you'll always have scenarios where people don't always agree. But the time that it becomes most relevant is when you then don't have it.
And that's when the conversation changes.
So, my life revolves around what I do, be it for my consulting work or what I'm doing at my small little plot. If I have a problem with the pump, everything gets put on hold so we can get that working again.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have the pump, we don't have water. And then
we don't
what?
Have fruit, we don't have vegetables.
Exactly.
We don't have,
Exactly. And we don't have the benefit of living like in the West, where you open your tap and it's assumed that water is just going to pour out 24/7.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if that assumption is going to stick for long.
Well, exactly. This is the scariest thought: is that it's happening all over the world.
Yeah.
There were no ornamental gardens that existed in this part of the world until Europeans came.
Yeah.
Everybody else's gardens were about vegetable production and the production of staples.
Yeah.
You look at old literature. So because of what I do, I've got a bunch of old literature from surveys that happened in the 30s and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And all the mentions of native gardens, as he calls them, are all to do with the production of food. Never was there an ornamental plant grown. It's only with the introduction of colonialism that ornamentals became an aspect of it. And slowly at first, now it's a lot more people, a lot more disposable income.
Yeah.
They have a much more, they have more house pride.
Yeah.
So they want their outdoors to look really nice. And then with the advent of social media, where you could share it to the world, that supercharged it, where now people are essentially turning around and it's become part of their personality, so to speak. Yeah. This is my garden, and it's great. I love it. But we do have to understand that one day water is going to disappear. And what are we going to do in the effect when that happens? I have a nursery where I grow plants because I do an interior plantscaping business aside from my consulting work, where I supply hotels and things like that and businesses with interior plants for their offices and things like that. If my borehole dried up, I would seriously then think, am I going to continue that business? Because that's going to be an added income, cost to bring it in.
Yeah.
If I can store enough rainwater in a year, my main scenario for that is how much do I need to run our household in that year, and then make sure that I've got that. Because I can't live at that site if you don't ever have water.
No. Man.
I can put in a solar system. I can't make water out of nothing. So what we're given at a certain time of year
That's what
I can try and save that and then ration it over the course of the year. But unlike a solar system where you can put it in and then, now everything except my cooker is running off solar, I can't just make water out of thin air. So it's a concern.
So
definitely a concern.
Back to Lilayi Lodge, because there's a lot we could talk about and I can see it now. But back to what you guys, what's your hope, like in terms of the safari, like the tree safari? What's your hope for this idea? About vegetation, may I say?
Well, I hope it brings about a much greater awareness of the stress that our vegetation here in Zambia experiences. People are way too quick, once things start to dry off, to pull out a match and burn. And if you do that, you are then affecting how that vegetation will develop going forward. People say, well, burning is tradition. Burning is tradition in as long as we can go back to, some of the oldest people in Zambia. Because beforehand, there weren't matches that you could pull out and light that fire and let it burn.
Yeah.
Fires were natural. It was controlled by nature. Effectively.
Yeah.
But when you then increase burning, especially on a yearly basis, you start to kill off certain species that are sensitive to fire, and you start to push that woodland towards a composition where species that are tolerant to fire become much more dominant. And, in doing so, you lose quite a bit of biodiversity, both plant and animal, that are dependent on a system that has fire in it, yes, but maybe every few years, not every year.
Yeah.
And it's not exacerbated strictly by fire. When we cut down woodlands, be it for charcoal or people making a new area for agriculture, you're removing a certain level of species that exist there that won't recover nearly as quickly as others that can grow really quickly.
Yeah.
So we do have an effect on the environment. What I would hope in terms of what could be done here is for people to actually get an idea as to what healthier systems look like, especially in town. The arboretum that's come up in the southwest of Lusaka is an old agricultural land that they're now revegetating and planting. And they've had natural regeneration, and they're also doing intervened regeneration by planting species in there, which is great because it gives us an idea of what different trees look like. Here, you've had an area that has not been cleared for the most part. There are areas of the lodges that were cleared when this was a working farm many, many years ago. But on the whole, they still kept most of the vegetation intact. And you can get an idea as to what actual, these dry Yombo woodlands would have looked like that would have covered this whole area long, long ago, but now, which is really impressive. And, the idea hopefully there is that people can develop an appreciation for areas like this, that they'd want to come out to an area like this and just kind of soak up nature, I always love that term that the Japanese have for their forest bathing. I can't remember the Japanese term off the bat right now, but that idea of going and reconnecting with nature, and feeling at home in that system, that then makes living in so-called concrete jungle much easier. Yeah. I live in Lusaka, but I love the fact that I can travel out and get into far-flung areas of Zambia that are not Lusaka.
Yeah.
Because it then makes living here, which I love, because I love the amenities of city, but I also love to get out and see the bush proper and come across things that you never expected when you went out on that walk. And this is the beauty of having a space like this, is that if you came this time of year, end of August, beginning of September, and you walked through the bush, you went to look at the trees.
Yeah.
If you come back in a month's time or 2 months' time, yeah, those trees are still there, but everything else has slowly changed.
Yeah.
You'll see new things that are popping up. You'll see new flowers that are there. If you wait another 2 months and do it again, that change will happen again. So it's that kind of idea of discovering what's out there. And then even though you might have come at this time of year, next year you come back, you all of a sudden see something that wasn't there that last time. And it's that kind of joy of seeing what nature has for us, effectively. It's that desire for people to kind of get out and experience the fact that we have, in total, we have almost 7,000 different species of plants in Zambia. And that's counting as well, because I've been involved in the collection and discovery of at least 5 species. There's a few more that we're waiting to hear about, effectively. So, we haven't found everything that is in Zambia, and it just might happen that you could walk across something, see it in flower, take a picture of it, only for it to be a new species.
Yeah.
And that's not just happened in the far-flung areas that have never been touched in Zambia. I've come across new species in settled areas in Western Province or in Northern Province. It's just that it wasn't collected before. Yeah. So if we can develop more interests that people have and more excitement about the woodlands, that would be a huge kind of basically win, for nature and for Zambia as a whole. We take for granted that we have all these trees in Zambia. It's never going to be guaranteed that that will always be the case. Yeah. Things disappear if you're not watching out for them. Yeah. And unfortunately, we take it too much for granted. We're not paying as much attention as we should.